We're pleased to speak to Professor Thomas Dempsey, who's currently a professor of security sector reform at the U.S. Army Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute. Professor Dempsey retired from the United States Army, where he was a colonel and served as the Foreign Area Officer for Africa. Professor Dempsey, does the military have a role in post-conflict economic reconstruction?
Well, I think it can have. Certainly the most direct role for the military in a post-conflict or a transitioning state is to carve out a secure area within which activities like economic development, reconstruction, stabilization can go forward. And to create the situation where other non-military members of the reconstruction stabilization team can do their job effectively. As far as a direct role, that's a little more problematic in terms of a direct military role in economic development and economic reconstruction. Certainly, the military brings a lot of capabilities to the table. It can do things, especially in an environment where the infrastructure's been damaged, where public services are in collapse, where there's a lack of functional governance. Military peace operations forces, for example, can do things that nobody else can do. Should they do those things is a different question. And a great example is you want to rebuild the village, rebuild a destroyed bridge in the village, and so you're sending your military unit to do it, and the military unit, having an engineer company, rebuilds the bridge, does a very good job of it, but standing around watching the military rebuild the bridge are 150 unemployed villagers who can't feed their families. So it kind of depends on the circumstances. To the extent that the military is undertaking activities that could be undertaken by, for example, host nation commercial sector or the host nation public sector, if it were properly resourced, consequences aren't necessarily obvious. There's another issue when the military begins getting involved in things that are really not the military's venue. For example, military economic assistance. To the degree that the military is performing functions that, especially if it's an external military, if it's an external peacekeeping force, and it's performing functions that the host nation civilian government is supposed to perform, even if you're performing those functions well, you can find yourself in a position where you're really delegitimizing the host nation government and making it difficult to restore legitimacy and functionality. A good example in Liberia were the ECOMOG company commanders out in the outlying villages where nothing was functioning. So here's a young Nigerian captain in command of the company that has occupied this area in rural Liberia. There are no public services. There's no functioning government. This place has been overrun basically by gangs with guns for years. Well, the young Nigerian captain sort of brings order, gets the guns off the street, but in a very real sense, he becomes judge, jury, and executioner. He becomes the mayor. He becomes everything because there's nothing else there. Now, the good news is that for the first time in years, that village has someone they can go to that has the resources and the desire to address their problems. The downside is it's not their village or their district or their county government. And so the young Nigerian captain is doing good things and his heart's in the right place. But his role as sort of the provider of last resort of public services, of authority, of justice, makes it very, very difficult to resurrect the Liberian state. And that has applicability on the economic side, just as it does on the justice and other public services.
So, in a way, I believe you've answered my question about some of the challenges that exist in the civil-military relations. Are there some other challenges that are creating tension with that relationship, whether it's with the civilian authorities in the country in which you're operating, or perhaps with the civilian authorities that are responsible for directing the military in the field? What are the kinds of challenges that the military individuals in the field face?
I think the biggest challenge in both the direct and the indirect role in the area of economic development is that the military commanders don't bring the kind of knowledge to that problem set that's necessary to really understand the consequences of their actions, really be able to prioritize and sequence events. And so, absent expertise from someone who really understands the mechanics of economic development, who has a clear grasp of all of the different aspects of development in that context, military commanders are ill-prepared to play that role. That's not to say that they don't sometimes play it very well. By and large, their hearts are in the right place. They're trying to make a difference. They're trying to do good things. Mm-hmm. So part of this is there's a need here to establish an effective collaborative partnership between the military and the economic development specialists, and also in the context of a peace operation between external peacekeeping forces and the host nation government. Because if your intent is to rebuild the legitimacy and functionality of the host nation ownership becomes critically important. This is as true for the economic sector as it is for the security sector, the justice sector, essential services sector.
What about the nation that's supporting the military there? For example, the United States civilians. Is there any role that the military might play in terms of our own civilian leadership as well as our own civilian population?
The issue that you raise is one that is sort of in a state of flux. Mm-hmm. In a simpler world, back during the Cold War, you had basically two situations. Either you're at war or you're at peace. And if you're at war, then you send in, and the United States is involved, then you send in a military force that is working for the Secretary of Defense and through the Secretary of Defense for the President, and the guy in charge is the military commander. If you're not in a state of war, then the guy in charge for the United States in that particular country is the chief of mission, typically the ambassador. And all of the various U.S. government personnel, military and civilian, that are working in that country answer to that chief of mission, who is the president's representative. And he's sort of the guy that pulls all the strings and where everything comes together. The problem that we're confronting today is the line between those two states, different states, is disappearing. And so now you have situations that look an awful lot like war in the old Cold War era, where we have joint task forces that have been deployed under the authority of the Secretary of Defense in regions where there is a U.S. chief of mission that is also exercising authority. And one of the things we're grappling with is how you deconflict that, and who's really going to be in charge, and how are they going to be in charge, who is going to build an effective collaborative strategy that brings everyone, not just on the U.S. government side, but on the host nation side, on our bilateral partner side, on the NGO side, on the international organization side, brings them all to the table and gets them all pulling in the same direction.
And therefore enhances the importance of strategic thinking on the part of each one of the individuals involved in that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things that we're learning is that that all of these various areas of activity, political, economic, security, humanitarian assistance, are all interrelated, and that you can't grapple with them in isolation. Everybody has to understand, to a degree, everybody else. And one of the things we need are models and vehicles and practices that develop a whole of government or whole of government's approach so that you can effectively prioritize and sequence various activities in all the areas of reconstruction and stabilization, and also so that you can make sure that you're not working at cross purposes. And so you understand how the decisions that I as a military commander make about where I send my forces and where I deploy my resources, how those decisions affect the political, the economic, the humanitarian side, and how decisions in those sectors affect me.
We are also concerned not just about the where, but the when. Is there a certain sequencing of the different desired end states? And I'd say specifically, do you feel that you can have a sustainable peace without or before you have economic recovery? Is there an interrelationship or an interdependency of peace and economic viability?
Well, this is the sequencing and prioritizing question. That is the $64,000 question. And the easy answer you get is, well, you have to do everything. And you have to do it all at once. Because my piece is just as important as your piece. And unfortunately, that answer is, as satisfying as it may be, it isn't very helpful. Because you do have limited resources. You may have limited time. And intuitively, kind of everybody who gets involved in this, I think, agrees that there are sequencing issues. There are some things that have to be done, some things that have to be done first, some things that have to be done second. But it's very difficult to pin someone down and get them to say what they think those are. Having said that, I will offer my own personal thoughts on that. And I would say that in a violence-prone environment where people are running around with guns shooting each other, the first thing you have to carve out space. However you do that, and by secure space, I mean get the guns off the street and stop people from killing each other, from killing civilians. That's not the same as fix the justice system and get the prisons running again and set the courts up. That's a different issue. We're just talking about stopping people from killing each other. For my money, that is the first thing that has to happen. The second thing that has to happen, and here's where I'm on much shakier ground, I believe the second thing that has to happen is you have to deal with the political issues. You have to deal with the issues of who is going to exercise power politically, how they are going to exercise it, and who, if you're the external player, who your partner in the host nation is going to be. We're talking about things like comprehensive peace agreements, transition agreements, negotiations to reconstitute some kind of political authority, all of those processes that ultimately, and the reason I say that I think you have to do that second, I don't think you can make genuine progress in stabilization and reconstruction without an effective host nation partner. So those would be, now, you asked about economic development. Development folks tend to take a long-term view and say, well, you know, we need to fix these things, but it's going to take a long time. And certainly if you're talking about making a country like Somalia economically viable and repairing all the damage that's been done in that country over a period of probably more than 40 years, then yes, you are talking about an effort that's probably going to take decades. On the other hand, you have immediate economic problems right now. One of the biggest of which is you've got a bunch of guys running around the streets that used to be carrying guns and shooting people. And because of my secure space I've carved out with my military, they're not doing that anymore, but they don't have jobs. They can't feed their families. And they got access to guns. That's one of the realities of the world today. The world is awash in weapons. So if I don't deal with the problem of those unemployed young men and women who are the ex-fighters and deal with it now, my little enclave of security that I've carved out is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is one of the areas where, in general, my answer about military involvement in economic development is that the military is not the best tool for jobs programs. The external player is not the best tool for jobs programs. Best tool for jobs programs is a host nation government. But you may not have a host nation government. An example was Ambassador Blaney in 2003 in Liberia, when the Taylor government had been completely discredited. It had been completely delegitimized. It was completely dysfunctional. And one of the things that Blaney did, because he had the ECOMOG force that he was working in partnership from the West African community of nations, had stopped the fighting. They carved out this secure space. They'd done that with help from some U.S. Marines. But now they had all these literally people were in the process of giving up their guns and had no source, no employment, no source of income. And so Ambassador Blaney created something that eventually were called Blaney Brigades. He rounded these guys up. He paid them a small wage to go out and clean up trash and dig out ditches. Simple stuff that they could do. Provided them occupation, kept them busy, provided them a little bit of income. Those are the sorts of things that the development guy may say, well, you know, that's not really contributing to long-term development. I mean, it's not teaching them any skills. It's not, it's taking labor off the street that maybe the private sector needs for something else. All true, to which I think Ambassador Blaney's answer would be, that's not going to help if they go get their AKs and start shooting people again.